Welcome to the podcast, Death, a Changing Industry. Today we have the great pleasure to welcome Deborah Leek Bailey OBE to talk about all things bereavement awareness, how this plays a part in the school education system and also in society. So we'll go straight over to Deborah now. And Deborah, firstly, thank you for joining us today on the podcast. And before I go into my questions, would you mind just giving us a bit of background on yourself and how you got involved in this area of expertise, please?
Sure. So I'm formerly a teacher, and then I became a senior leader in the state sector, and I've worked in both state and independent schools, and I became a head teacher. And whilst I was a head teacher, and indeed throughout my career, I've obviously been aware of children who've experienced death within their families and close sort of family relations, and the impact that it can have if it's dealt with badly as well as if it is dealt with well, and those longer term outcomes, and trying to make children more resilient and being able to work through their trauma is, I think, really important. And most people, in fact, very few people go into teaching for any other reason that they want to make a difference. It became very evident to me when I was witnessing young people experiencing death in that way that there were things we could do to make their life easier. And part of that was around planning. But also I became a government advisor after headship, and I did some work with the RAF and the MOD. And in all of those instances, people would discuss with me loss and grief and how it forever changes people. And there was a common thread about, you'll get over it. I hope you'll get over it. And sort of thinking, well, actually, you never, ever get over it. You learn to live with it. So that kind of had me thinking. And one of my close friends was a family liaison officer with the police. And she worked at Child Bereavement UK. And she often spoke about the projects they were doing and how they were launching into schools. And so what we then did was we piloted with the charity some sort of school hub work, and we identified kind of cold spots. And because of the work I was doing with the DFE at the time, it made sense that we'd look at areas of deprivation and how, if you're a child living in an area of deprivation, you've obviously got things stacked against you to begin with, but if you then experience grief, then your outcomes are significantly diminished, and how we eradicate that became a really burning desire for me. And so I spent quite a bit of time liaising with Child Bereavement UK, and they asked me to come on board and become a trustee. I did that for, I think it was about 5 years. And I'm now working for a global charity education development trust, and I'm their director of schools. So again, I'm back hearing all those stories. When I worked with my designated safeguarding leads in the schools, we set up a group of deputy DSLs and DSLs, and we talked about grief and death and naming it as death, calling it out, and how teachers, because they want to make young people feel as secure and safe as possible, sometimes can soften the messages around something which is really very, very tough for everyone to deal with, but particularly the person at the centre of that, the child. In my career, as I say, I've seen death and bereavement dealt with very, very well by schools. And in some instances, when I think back to my early career and even my involvement in it, sometimes not quite so well. As I've gone along and along the way, I've talked to teachers about what I think works, but I've also listened to the things that they've said to me they have struggled with when they, experience death within their own families, say, and then it's brought back to life in a very vivid way when they're trying to support others. And the responsibility we have in the education sector to also support teachers And one of the first things I think about that is ensuring that they're well prepared and well informed, and they know where to go for support themselves when they're trying to support others.
Yep. No. Well, thank you so much for that insight into the work that you have done and continue to do. I agree with my involvement at Child Bereavement UK. They are a very special charity and organisation. So yeah, just a huge thank you for all that you're doing. So you and I have spoken prior to this meeting today, and this talk today, about the importance of proactive conversations rather than reactive conversations. And you've got a vast amount of experience in talking to different heads of schools about their experiences. Could you expand further on the differences and why you think proactive is the way to go rather than reactive? And we spoke about policies as well. Could you give some insight into your views around that, please?
I think what happens is that whenever an incident of death occurs, whether it be something outside of school that then is brought into school, or it can be the tragic death of a child, the death of a member of staff, but it triggers inevitably emotions in all of us because, most of us are empathetic beings. We want to support others. We feel bad for them for that sense of loss they experience. And therefore, we also must acknowledge we're in some kind of emotional state, even if we are professional beings who have that veneer of being in control. And so therefore, when an incident occurs, I believe it is much better to be prepared by having a policy that everybody's familiar with, and they might not know it off by heart, but they certainly know where to go to access it. And what they also do is they have that security of knowing that there is an agreed protocol in terms of the way one needs to behave in those circumstances. And so even the best policy, let's not make any mistake about it, on the day, at the time, you will deviate slightly from it. But that's because your circumstances are always going to be slightly different, and there is no blanket way to address every situation where death and grief are concerned. But what I have certainly found is that in the schools where they've had policies in place, staff know that there is somebody who's going to be the designated lead in relation to communicating messaging. It avoids families having lots of people trying to do well and contact them to let them know their concern, and the poor families then having to relive telling their story because the school has agreed who it will be and what the contact will be. It's things like the information we provide to the pupils, to the teachers. It's about making sure that other families, if there's been a pupil who's experienced death within their own family, then their peer group are going to be very aware of that. And it's about the messaging around it. With the best will in the world, children are at school all day long, but they go home to other people. And so keeping those other people informed, but also in a way that's respectful to the family dealing with their grief. And so touching base with the family and ensuring that messaging meets with their approval. They're all things that mean when we're lurching through this crisis of sadness, inevitably in most instances, that's the prevalent thing people feel, is a huge sense of sympathy and empathy, concern for those that are undergoing the situation, but also making sure we do it right, that we don't become indulgent with our own sense of whatever loss we've experienced too. And I've found that keeping people in the loop, giving them factual information very frequently is really important. and especially children, because children have this wonderful imagination. And so if you don't tell them things, their brain will go into overdrive, making up the possibilities, which could be endless. And so you're protecting the family, you're protecting the person who's died and their memory, and being respectful to the way they would want to be treated. And of course, there are also cultural differences as well. And you know, plays a major part, because in some cultures, it's not necessarily prevalent for them to be talking very openly about death and discussing, and exhibiting extreme sadness, but it doesn't mean they're not feeling those things. And so being mindful about what's appropriate at the right time. And, I found that even if I didn't have anything that I had been updated on, I would let people know that too.
Yeah.
Because then it wasn't a case of them thinking everyone knew something they didn't, and not knowing how to react to situations. I will share with you that when I was a young teacher, there was the tragic situation of the Zeebrugge ferry disaster, and it was where the ferry had left its lower deck open and the water came in, and many, many people died on that trip that was meant to obviously be a fantastic trip overseas. And I was teaching one of the children of the victims of that tragedy, and I'd only been teaching about a year and a half. I remember very clearly the child come to school that morning, very vibrant personality, gone home that night to the empty house, and then of course the police starting to make the connections and inform people. But that girl came to school with parents and went home without them and never had them again. And I just look back on that situation and I know for sure that the school could have done more to support that child.
Yeah.
And that really makes me sad to think that as a young teacher, what I was being told was, don't make a fuss. And you could see that child was crying out for somebody to just say, are you okay? What can we do for you? What do you want? And I think we've come a long way as teachers since then. I certainly hope so. I know that there are still schools where they wait for things to happen. And I think if we can be proactive, don't we owe that to the people who are experiencing such extreme pain in their lives? And it's the least we can do, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's if we can have these conversations which will affect us all, there's lots to unpick there, what you've just said. Firstly, about the one size does not fit all, which is so correct, but having that policy in place just to go to is really, really helpful. It's a starting point. But also as well, like having these conversations at a younger age, having that awareness within the schools, like you said, that person that you looked after and that experience that you went through, is missed opportunities. That's what I find terribly sad, because the whole experience can be so much better, and then the outcome and the community is together and can actually have some tools, simple tools, and knowing how to talk and help. What's interesting as well is that if we can have some tools given to us at a young age to see us through to adulthood, there's people that you and I will both know who will prefer to cross the street, not prefer to, but have to cross the street because they're not sure what to say. So actually having some basic tools again, which we can give to young people and have, being around it at a young age can really have an impact on society. So with that then, we have, following the petition last year, which finished in April, the Department for Education we have down for the end of February this year, 2024, carry out the consultation to add content on death, dying and bereavement into the national curriculum as part of their consultation to look at that. I think we have a real opportunity to really help society come together and have more compassion in society and more awareness and more care and kindness and better communication. What are your thoughts? Do you see any dangers with this, or do you think it will help and then it will lead on to that policy that you've spoken about so well too?
I think it's very important to have something embedded into the curriculum, because For many children, there's a sort of this mystical association with death. There's a sense that it's the unknown, it's scary, but we know as adults that it is inevitable. And it may start with their pet dying. I know that my husband said to me when he was younger, they were looking after a neighbour's budgerigar and it flew out of the cage and unfortunately it died. And so what they did was they replaced it, hoping the person wouldn't notice.
Yeah.
But unfortunately it wasn't the right colour tone and the person did notice. And I sort of thought to myself, it's really fascinating because we try and fix things, don't we? Where, that's what we do. And sometimes you can't fix something. What you can do is acknowledge it's happened. If a child experiences a death, then whether that be a grandparent or a parent, sibling, very close friend, what happens is we can't change the fact that's happened. But by being more aware, by helping young people to be more aware that they can go through a variety of different reactions, for example, and that they may very well experience disbelief. They can likely feel angry that it has happened and, why has it happened? It's not fair. They may feel very sad. And some of them will inevitably be feeling, if there's a loss within a class, they'll feel all those things at different times. It won't, we don't go in this linear kind of process in regards to grief. And so I think even for young people themselves to understand that their best friend, who they thought really liked pupil A, and pupil A has died, just because they're not crying every 5 minutes doesn't mean to say they're not hurting terribly.
Yeah.
And so I think managing peer group pressure is reduced when you include something in the curriculum. It needs to be dealt with sensitively. We need to educate around death and grief and traumatic loss and resilience, and how, if we know that it's part of a life cycle and that it's a privilege to be alive, and what we do with our lives for however long we're on this planet, that's really important, and that when people who we love are no longer physically with us, we can carry them around in our heart and in our memories, and we can create memory boxes, or, different people have different ways of remembering the people they love. But talking about it and talking about it with your classmates, and if you're much younger, teachers finding ways through picture and story and physical activity to help youngsters understand those things, that I think it shouldn't be optional. That's education, isn't it? We're educating youngsters for life.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think, like you say, the having that choice is really important, to opt in or opt out, especially if you've recently had a loss. But educating the class friends is equally as important, to sort of have that compassion throughout. The loss of my mum when I was 12, I know it firsthand that you can feel so isolated because you feel like nobody else knows what you're going through. And actually, you just get on with it. And it's not a case of, it's not a sob story, you just get on with things. But actually, as we said right at the start, this whole journey and period in time, which is difficult, can be so much better than what a lot of schools have in place at the moment. And again, I think the key part of this as well is age appropriate. That's the critical wording to use. So depending on that sort of school age, the material has changed accordingly.
I'm a parent, I know that our children require structure. And I remember as a child myself, which parent I would go to get the answer I wanted from. I'm very privileged. I've still got both my mum and dad alive. But I also kind of know, because of the age they are, I'm not going to have them around for that much longer. But I hope it's for forever. But, it's that knowledge that you have as an adult. But I think as a child, what happens, and as a young person at school, that and university, that we know that people require structure, and that in embedding in the curriculum and in policies a format that people can follow, that's tried and tested and has proven to be successful, then surely all of us would want that. And certainly as a parent, I would hope that those things were being addressed in school, because none of us are experts on our own. It doesn't matter what we do for a living. And the more help and the more openness, the more transparency there is around grief, the better we are at cracking how to actually deal with it when it impacts on us personally, I think.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. And also, like you say, your parents won't be here forever. It gives us an understanding and appreciation that our loved ones aren't here forever. I arrange funerals for people, families, individuals who could be in their 60s, arranging a funeral for their parents, and they never considered that it's like a denial almost, but the awareness that their mums and dads might die one day when they're in our care, they are totally overwhelmed, in a state of fear almost. And I'm not saying we can remove sadness from loss, but just having some awareness. So what I'm trying to get at is, I think we'll actually have better lives with a bit more gratitude and the more awareness of our surroundings as well, in my opinion. So you've got experience as well in talking to heads of schools and their responses. Could you go into more detail at all and unpick that about what sort of responses you've seen from the evidence?
Yeah, so I wrote an article for TEDS, for the Times Education Supplement, a couple of years ago, and it was on resilience. So I approached school leaders and I said, I'm going to write an article, and I'd be really interested to know if you've experienced any tragedies at school, what impact that had on your school community. And I received a phenomenal amount of very personal, privileged information, where people shared their innermost heartfelt thoughts on how the long-term impact of those scenarios. One person talked about losing a child on a school trip, the child dying on a ski accident, how you then have to legislate for the trauma that the other children are experiencing, and the family back home who actually their child left and they were perfectly fine and then they never come home, and the media coverage, the media frenzy, and there was a consistent thread through a lot of the information they shared with me, these head teachers, which was that their own feelings were put on hold completely. They didn't allow themselves to think about stuff, because what they did was they placed clearly the needs of the family as paramount, and the pupils, the teachers who take the trip, and all that kind of self-doubt, and what if I hadn't organised this, and all of that, and could I have done this better and differently. And actually in that instance it was an accident, a tragic accident that had devastating consequences. But this particular head said that the teacher who organised the trip and was on the trip returned to school, and they did have a bereavement policy in place. And I referenced earlier that I'd done some work with the RAF, and actually the military have some very good policies, as you would know. And this particular individual had military training previously, and he said, I went for the handbook and I looked and I, cross-referenced all the different information and went with the thing I thought was best. But he said the teacher didn't exhibit what he would have anticipated as the usual signs of grief. And then about 3 years later, that teacher had a nervous breakdown. That was what was put on the form at the time, probably more sensibly described now. But what they said was the teacher never returned to work after that point. And when the head went to visit the teacher said it was only then, all those years later, 3 years later, that they had allowed themselves to grieve, because the enormity of the experience was so extreme, and they'd been all things to all people subsequently, that was the moment it kicked in. And the head said when he started to speak to the person, he realised that even though they brought in counselling for the staff and the pupils and, professionals were involved, he hadn't really explored his own grief.
Yeah.
And then he and that member of staff shared a lot at that point. And I think that's important to note, because it sort of tells me that the thing we know, which is you can't put a time frame on any of this stuff.
No.
So, but I also had a teacher who talked to me about a child who'd been shot in a tragic accident. And there was media coverage of it because it was a family member. It was a total accident, but the press got hold of the story, and the teacher said no matter how much they had said to the school members, don't speak to the press, and they had the designated media lead, he said what they found was the press kind of were trying to talk to children and other families from the class, and and how that head didn't have control over that. They communicated that the family would rather it didn't happen, but it nevertheless did occur. And they, these heads talked to me about the memorials that they did for the people who died, the children who died. They spoke about having like a table of flowers and a book, and people condolence could write in it, but that there was a set time for that kind of thing, but that also people needed to importantly be told where that book then went if they wanted to add something afterwards. But then there was the more permanent reminder, the thing that the school community wanted and the family wanted. So whether it be a tree being planted or a picture being hung or something, and where it was, and if it ever moved at a later point, where it went to, so it would know. But the heads across the board said, one, they didn't feel prepared, even though they, no matter how much training they'd had and how many policies they had. What they did, though, is feel that a framework of reference gave them the toolkit to almost like a checklist to know where to start and to make sure they didn't miss the crucial stuff out. We were saying earlier, 1 in 29 children have lost a significant adult. So you think about that, in every single class, somebody's experienced not just death in general, but a significant bereavement.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with what you stated there. And just going back to the 1 in 29 who will lose someone close to them in every classroom in the UK. But actually, what we didn't say really, what I haven't said, is that's 1 in 29 will suffer a close loss. But actually, what we saw when the Queen died, the nation was grieving. So how you measure a close loss is always going to be difficult. So it's every 22 minutes in the UK a parent dies, but actually someone's grandmother might be closer to them than their mother. So it's how you measure almost pain. So how you measure the success of education is always going to be difficult, but we just know how important this is.
We can't make presumptions about somebody else's relationship, because when someone dies, the child or any individual may not have had a good relationship with that person. And it may not be the worst thing that's ever happened to them.
Mm.
But there are tricky things around that psychologically as well.
Yes.
Because, you know, I've encountered young people who had terrible relationships with one of their parents, and then the parent dies, and there's guilt in there, and, you know, lots of anger and resentment, and, you know, you were never there for me when you were alive, and now you've left me completely. And you know, I can remember a child saying that to me and being so angry, and instead of, again, trying to fix it, you know, what I learned was it was much better to allow them to own that feeling. That was quite legitimate to feel that way. And who am I to say, oh, you know, but maybe this and maybe that. That's how they felt, and it was important to know it.
Yeah, you're so right. I've experienced before for funeral services, when actually there's been a really difficult relationship under terrible, you know, extreme circumstances. But actually, I've witnessed the next of kin being at the crematorium, despite all these awful events that have happened in their life, and actually the grief coming out, like you say, is a mixture of emotions: guilt, anger, relief, and then you have guilt from feeling relief. But it's really important that they have that opportunity, and actually that we don't judge, because we don't know. And that's the thing with these cycles of grief and bereavement models. I have concerns around them because, you know, like we said earlier on, it's not one size fits all. We're all individual. Our relationships are always individual, so therefore we can't simply provide a simple answer. But just being present, listening, and giving people that space and compassion and care, I think it's starting us off in a really positive place. And also, you mentioned about the Child Bereavement UK website. The letters are on there, templates are on there. And that's how I see my role in this, really, is that all this stuff, people like yourself are out there doing amazing work. Child Bereavement UK have all the templates. There's other charities with lesson plans. There's schools not having any policies or plans in place. It's just, I want to connect it all up now. It's all out there.
Yeah, and that's why these podcasts are important. Because one person on their own can't make that difference, but collectively we can really have an impact. And, you know, CB UK is a phenomenal charity, because some charities only deal with their own stuff, whereas CB UK are really good at signposting to others they think may do it differently, better, whatever. And I think that's really important. But I think it's also that we should be constantly learning and never presume. And teachers, you know, goodness knows, they have enough to deal with every day. They don't know when they go into school what could happen during the course of the day, but no one prepares you for the significant impact that can happen with the death of a child in school. That, you know, and I've seen that firsthand, and it is just soul destroying. It's so sad. And, you know, and we're never going to get it right. Some parents want you at the funeral, other parents don't. Some people want a bigger display and are inclusive in terms of children being in attendance. Other people don't want them anywhere near, and it's about being respectful of that. But it's also about afterwards, if a child becomes more withdrawn or very outrageously loud, or it's the change factor that's important. We really need to rethink, because professionals go into teaching, as I said earlier, to make a difference. However small, you hope to make a difference. And and I think that's really, really important, to acknowledge that we don't know everything.
No, well, Deborah, thank you so much. It's been fascinating to sort of unpick your mind on this. Someone who's so much knowledge in this area and all your experiences. Just a huge thank you. And as I said right at the start, thank you for the work that you've done and continue to do. It's so important. And I hope I can play a small part as well in seeing these important conversations being connected and talked about throughout the UK. So just a huge thank you from us all. And let's please stay in touch.
Thank you very much. I would finish by saying, the more I do and the more I learn, the more I realise how little I know and how much more I've got to learn. And I think that's why what you're doing is really, really important. And if I can help, if anyone wants us to reach out to me, then by all means, they can do so, because together we can make that difference.
Thanks, Deborah. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
A huge thank you for watching our podcast, Death, a Changing Industry. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel as we have some fascinating guests lined up. Thank you so much.